Welcome, everyone. Today, we are taking a seriously epic cinematic journey into one of the most fascinating and frankly misunderstood forces on our entire planet. We're talking about the atom, specifically the uranium atom. We're going to trace its incredible path from a silent, ancient rock buried deep underground all the way to the power grid that's literally lighting up your home right now. And of course, we'll talk about its terrifying potential to unleash unprecedented destruction. We're going to break down the science, the mind-boggling engineering, and the massive global stakes step by step. Let's dive in.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to cleanly demystify this whole process for you. First, we'll look at the power of uranium, then extraction and conversion, the enrichment process, peace versus weapons, inside a nuclear reactor, and finally, waste and geopolitics.
All right, Section 1, the power of uranium, a microscopic giant.
When a German scientist first identified uranium way back in 1789, it just looked like a heavy, gray rock. Absolutely no one knew the mind-bending energy hiding inside. To really put that sheer, concentrated density into perspective, think about the number 1,800. A single processed pellet of uranium, we're talking about something the size of a tiny peanut, holds the exact same energy equivalent as 1,800 pounds of coal or 150 gallons of oil. It's wild. Imagine powering your entire neighborhood for months with a little rock you could casually hold between your thumb and index finger. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that when you pull natural uranium out of the ground, it's actually not all the exact same stuff. Think of it kind of like different models of the exact same car. In chemistry, these are called isotopes. Over 99.3% of natural uranium is a heavy, super stable model called U-238. It basically just sits there doing nothing. Only a tiny, tiny fraction, a mere 0.7%, is U-235. And that incredibly rare model is the only one unstable enough to easily split and create a chain reaction. So to actually get any useful energy, we have to isolate that tiny 0.7%.
Moving on to Section 2, extraction and chemical conversion. Unearthing the atom.
Okay, so before we can split any atoms, we actually have to get this highly dangerous rock out of the ground safely. And trust me, that's way harder than it sounds. In places like Saskatchewan, Canada, there's this massive layer of water-filled sandstone sitting directly above the pure uranium ore. If you just dig straight down, the entire mine floods instantly. Game over. So engineers use a technique straight out of a sci-fi movie, artificial ground freezing. They pump a super-chilled, negative 30 degrees Celsius calcium chloride brine deep, deep into the earth. This literally freezes the groundwater into massive, impenetrable solid ice walls to protect the miners. It is extreme engineering at its finest.
Once it's safely mined, that raw rock is crushed down into a concentrated yellow powder that we call yellow cake. But we run into a major problem here. You can't easily sort solid dust on a microscopic level. It physically needs to be a fluid. So through an incredibly complex chemical conversion, that solid yellow cake is completely transformed into uranium hexafluoride, which is a highly reactive gas. Turning it into this gas is the absolute vital bridge to the next and most famous step of the whole process.
Which brings us to Section 3, the enrichment process, spinning the elements. Okay, let's dive into this.
This right here is the absolute beating heart of the nuclear fuel cycle. And globally, it's for sure the most complex and controversial step. Enrichment is quite simply the artificial process of increasing that tiny percentage of the splittable U-235 isotope within a batch of natural uranium. Remember how raw uranium only has 0.7% U-235? Because of that, it's virtually useless for a power plant or a weapon. We absolutely must artificially concentrate it to make it work.
To actually do this, scientists use massive, sprawling arrays of machines called centrifuges. And the best way to visualize this? Think of a giant high-tech salad spinner. The uranium gas is fed into these tall cylinders, which then spin at a mind-boggling 70,000 revolutions per minute. Through pure centrifugal force, the slightly heavier U-238 atoms are flung outward against the walls, while those lighter, highly prized U-235 atoms gather right in the center. It's literally a game of microscopic weight differences, repeated thousands and thousands of times.
Section 4, peace versus weapons, the thresholds of power.
Now, here is the really sobering reality about enrichment. It's a dual-use technology. The exact same centrifuges used to make civilian electricity can also be used to create the core of an atomic bomb. The dividing line is purely mathematical. If you enrich to 3 to 5%, you get civilian power. Push it up to 20%, you get medical research isotopes and submarine fuel. At 90% and above, you have weapons-grade fissile material. As noted by international monitors like IIEA, Iran currently enriches uranium up to the 60% threshold. This is a massive, factual focal point in global diplomacy right now because it sits far above normal civilian needs, but just below what you'd need for a weapon. So the crucial point is really understanding the physics behind these percentages. Going from 0 to 20% enrichment actually takes the most time and the most energy. Why? Because you are filtering out a massive, massive bulk of unwanted U-238. Reaching that 20% mark actually represents about 90% of the total effort needed to get all the way to weapons grade. Once a facility breaches 20%, and certainly when it hits 60%, the final sprint to 90% takes mere weeks, not years.
Section 5. Inside a nuclear reactor. Harnessing the chain reaction.
Let's step away from the weapons side of things for a second and look at how that 3 to 5% enriched civilian uranium actually lights up whole cities. First, the enriched gas is chemically turned back into a powder and baked into those little ceramic pellets we talked about earlier. Those pellets are then stacked inside long, highly specialized metal tubes made of zirconium. Zirconium is the perfect material here because it withstands absolutely intense heat, but it acts almost like a net, allowing neutrons to easily pass right through it. Hundreds of these tube bundles are then put together to make up the actual reactor core.
Inside that core, neutrons strike the U-235, splitting the atoms and releasing immense, incredible heat. This heat boils water into steam to spin a massive turbine. Now in the US, we mainly use two types of light water reactors. Pressurized water reactors keep the water under such intense pressure that it physically cannot boil, instead transferring its heat to a secondary water supply. Boiling water reactors, on the other hand, just boil the water directly inside the main vessel. But both systems achieve the exact same final result, spinning a massive generator to send steady, reliable electricity directly to the device you're watching or listening to this explainer on right now.
And finally, Section 6, Waste and Global Geopolitics, the Aftermath.
So, we've traced the atom from the mine all the way to the turbine. But the story doesn't just end when your lights turn on. Because of the extreme risks involved, uranium isn't sold on an open market like oil or gold. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the world's atomic watchdog, is constantly monitoring. They use on-the-ground inspectors, 24/7 satellite surveillance, and highly sensitive environmental Geiger counters to track every single ounce globally. They have to ensure that peaceful energy programs don't suddenly pivot in the dark.
And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate paradox of nuclear energy. On one hand, you have an incredibly dense, zero-carbon energy source that provides roughly 10% of all global electricity without releasing a single greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. It's incredibly clean for the air. But, on the other hand, the spent fuel rods that eventually come out of those reactors are dangerously radioactive. They have to be submerged in 30-foot deep cooling pools for years and then moved to massive concrete dry casks where they remain hazardous for millennia. It is a permanent waste problem.
Which leaves us with the ultimate, lingering question. Can human intelligence, diplomacy, and engineering safely contain the atomic forces we've so brilliantly unleashed? From freezing underground mines to centrifuges spinning at supersonic speeds, uranium represents the absolute peak of human innovation. And, quite possibly, our greatest existential test. Thank you so much for joining me on this epic journey through the nuclear fuel cycle. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and I'll see you in the next explainer.